Yes, so I'm very pleased to be speaking to you today. It's a great privilege, and I hope this will be perhaps a light-hearted end to the day, because even there's some longer debates in which it's questioned and quite really soliciting inputs and suggestions from you, because I'm not saying I have all of the answers. I'm saying that I'm just putting some questions out there. So if we can have the next slide, please. Or can I move the slides?
Sorry, I think you have command over the slides. So if you just click on the slide in the first place, and then you should be able to flick through the slides using your arrows on the keyboard.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
So, much appreciated. So, there's a this is an outline of the presentation. I'm going to give a bit of a backstory to why I'm asking an apparently why I've put together a rather abstract theoretical paper. So there is actually a practical backstory. I'm going to talk about what epistemology is and why it matters. I'm going to be talking about why it's interesting to think about cybersecurity and epistemology together. And I'm now then going to sort of explain why my paper doesn't really have much about ontology. So I don't have much of the detail of cybersecurity. I don't have assets and vulnerabilities and threat actors in here, because when you're looking at epistemology, you're looking at the root of knowledge, so you don't actually bring in the knowledge entities at the beginning. Then I'm going to explain the questions and just outline the questions that I've raised in the paper. Sorry. Then I'm going to explain the cybersecurity definition I've chosen. Then I'm going to explain and outline the questions that are within the paper. I won't give all the questions, and then really open it up for discussion. So I'm going to try and get through the first few slides fairly quickly so that we can get into discussion. I'm pressing right arrow. Oh, there we are. So the backstory is that I'm doing what I wanted before I started my PhD. I wanted to do field research in cybersecurity rather than lab research. So I did my master's in information security at Royal Holloway, and after I finished that, I took some time out to consider what I wanted to do next, and I decided I didn't really want to do just lab research. That would mean that I would learn maybe more about technology and more about crypto, more about theory, but I wouldn't really learn about the practice of cybersecurity in the real world. So it took me some time to decide where I was going to do my fieldwork. I looked at possibly doing PhD research at UCL in London, where they have the UCL secret program that does a lot of cybercrime research. But eventually I came across the field of physical construction as an interesting area, and an area where there are lots of people looking at a brave new world ideas of how there are going to be smart cities and how everything's going to be digitally enabled. And there are lots of people doing the whole life cycle of physical construction, from building information modeling, implementing things with cranes and robots, designing intelligent transportation systems, potentially making an amazing difference to the economics of building production using things like 3D concrete printers. You probably know you can put up a house that would last maybe 150 years for about $10,000. That would be enough to accommodate a small family in many parts of the world. So there's amazing economics around using new construction techniques. And then you get into the life cycle of buildings, where you have building access control, CCTV, public safety, sustainable building energy management. So there's a lot of there's a whole gamut of different areas where construction is using technology, but there isn't really anybody specialising in cybersecurity and construction. And so if you do know of anybody who's doing cybersecurity and construction, please put them in touch with me. It'd be great to network. Interesting thing was for me when I was starting this research is that my supervisors are mainly from an anthropology background, sociology background, social sciences, and they're used to looking at technology very much from a point of view of seeing technology as a human practice, and looking at all types of technology, from old-fashioned tools that might be used in construction right through to modern digitally enabled tools. And they have a very normally a very coherent approach to the use of technology as a human activity and socially constructed, so people's values and people's priorities are influencing what's getting constructed. So it's a really interesting place to be working, multidisciplinary area. So this has really exposed me since I started my PhD to the importance of epistemology and to really knowing the roots of knowledge. And I was able to get through my undergraduate and through my masters without necessarily knowing very much about epistemology. But if you're going to make a contribution to human knowledge at PhD level, you're expected to know about the roots of your knowledge. And so whilst we understand that not all knowledge, not all cybersecurity knowledge is of the grade that merits the idea of being epistemologically pure, of being high level academic knowledge, there's a lot of other human knowledge that isn't of that degree of purity, but you are expected to address the purity of your knowledge when you're getting into higher levels of academic research. And so this has been very interesting for me. And I suddenly realised, as I've engaged with epistemology, that there's a lot of overlap between epistemology and cybersecurity. So you have the idea that epistemology is about being secure in your knowledge, having justified true belief, being able to know that what you're saying is true and be able to know why it's true, not just that it is true, but how it came to be true. And if you have cyber, particularly integrity attacks, in cybersecurity integrity attacks, where the knowledge that you're working on is being corrupted, then that would be a threat to epistemology. So if you have fraud, simulations, if you have deep fakes, if you have somebody who is impersonating an authoritative source, that would be a threat to epistemology. But equally, when you look at cybersecurity, you realise that there's inherent asymmetry in cybersecurity, and it's often inherent asymmetry in knowledge. It might not be asymmetry in resources, because somebody with a very small amount of resource but a high amount of knowledge could actually mount a cybersecurity attack, and maybe somebody with a very large amount of resources but not enough knowledge couldn't survive a cybersecurity attack. So there's an inherent relationship between cybersecurity and epistemology at a quite a deep level. And the other thing I noticed was that even though there's now a document out there, the UK government has published a cybersecurity body of knowledge, which had input from lots of academics representing different disciplines. There's 18 knowledge domains. There wasn't much talk about the basis of knowledge in that. There's lots of discussions about the ontologies of those different domains in cybersecurity, but really not much talk about the common ground. Like, is there an underlying view that a lot of this knowledge is being socially constructed and influenced by different forces, or is this all implying a positive, realist epistemology? So it's not much talked about in these public domain documents, and I thought it's important to put some questions out there about epistemology. So now I need to talk about the relationship between epistemology and ontology. So whenever you see an ontology, and ontologies have been presented in this conference before, you'll typically see some entities and relationships between those entities, and there's an existing knowledge that those entities have a mode of existence. They might be temporary entities, they might be durable entities, they might be human entities, they might be people, they might be processes, they might be technologies, but the entities that are being studied are known to exist, and therefore they're included in the ontology. But really, it's important to take a step back from ontology and to look at epistemology and say, well, how do we know that these things, these entities, are real, and that it's worthy of including them in the entity? And are we being consistent? Are all of the entities that we include in an ontology consistent epistemologically? Are some of the entities we're looking at of one type? Are they, for example, if we look at an entity like a vulnerability, is, to what extent is that vulnerability a physical artifact that existed without any human input? To what extent is that something which actually had to be discovered by a human realizing that particular technology, that particular configuration, could be abused in a particular way, and that wasn't knowable to the designers, and therefore it was a new human constructed knowledge that arose after the creation of the original artifact. So it's really important to do epistemology early, and then when we're thinking about ontologies to rethink how is this ontology supported by an underlying epistemology. And when we're doing multidisciplinary research, it's quite helpful to have an epistemological conversation before we talk ontologies, because whenever we talk ontologies, we tend to talk about things that we know very well. And if I start a conversation and I talk about entities that I'm very familiar with, that could be a language that other researchers in a different domain don't understand. So when I engage with construction stakeholders, I don't want to be coming along with all of the burdens of language of my domain of cybersecurity, information security, and starting to use those entities with them. I need to be getting to the roots of knowledge with those and having a shared understanding of the roots of knowledge before getting into the ontological research. So that's why I feel that epistemology is an important area to focus on in research and really establish some common understanding with other researchers before we move into our own specialist areas. So one does have to, however, put some limits on the extent of one's epistemological inquiry. If one talks generally about the roots of knowledge, then one's into the realms of philosophy, and that's an almost unbounded exploration that could go on for many years, and there have been many people who specialise in just in the philosophy of knowledge, and they're doing purely theoretical research. But actually, I'm interested in epistemology not just because I want to be a philosopher, or I want to have some deep understanding about aspects of life that might be very durable over hundreds of years, over centuries. I'm quite interested in having practical epistemology that's actionable in my lifetime. So I want to put some boundaries around the scope of my research, and I want to say what is the scope of my epistemological inquiry, what's the scope of my roots of knowledge inquiry. So I need to put up a definition that limits the ontologies that I might consider in scope. And so I've looked at different definitions of cybersecurity, and this is an adaptation of an existing cybersecurity definition, which I feel is about right for putting the boundaries around what I consider to be cybersecurity. So I've said cybersecurity is the state of being protected against impacts arising from unauthorized or accidental access to computer-mediated resources, or the measures taken to achieve it. It's a pretty broad definition, but it's also not too specific about the ontologies. It doesn't talk about assets. It doesn't talk about vulnerabilities. It doesn't talk about threats. It doesn't talk attacks. It doesn't talk about exposures, and it also doesn't limit the interest to, for example, the internet. It doesn't talk about cyberspace. So there are other definitions that use cyberspace, but then that limits the field of inquiry to the internet. So all I've really said here is that there needs to be some computer-mediated resource. It could be a single device, or it could be multiple devices or a network, but there has to be some computer mediation in order for it to be cybersecurity. So I've tried to come up with a fairly generic definition, and also there's an element to which I'm in adopting this definition of cybersecurity. I'm saying that cybersecurity has a real existence, and there are some people who do research and write about cybersecurity as if it were entirely a sort of fiction, a make-believe, an imaginary world in which lots of people are engaging just in political influencing of other people to obtain resources for cybersecurity research. And it might surprise you, if you're working in cybersecurity, that there's a lot of literature out there that is effectively skeptical about cybersecurity as a valid field of academic learning. It's a new field. It's not surprising other people would be skeptical, but I just want to say this is. I don't take the view that it's an entirely effectively human constructed field. There is some physical reality in cybersecurity. So in the main body of the paper, I've raised a number of questions, and they broadly fit into the sort of taxonomy you might expect any set of questions to fulfill. I didn't reference Rudyard Kipling's 6 wise men, but effectively you have the what and the why and the where and who and how and when. You have the linguistic apparatus of raising questions, and of course I didn't specifically talk about Socrates and Socratic method of inquiry, but effectively I've put out there a candidate list of questions that could be asked about the roots of cybersecurity knowledge, and I'm really interested in, have I captured the key questions, have I missed out the key questions, really interested in feedback. Would these questions be useful to other PhD researchers who are trying to think about the roots of knowledge of their inquiries? Are they a useful resource? Have I completely gone off the rails with this list of questions? So some questions about where cybersecurity knowledge arises from. I have a particular view that most cybersecurity knowledge is now arising outside academia. It's very important to academia to be aware of the fact that real cybersecurity knowledge is being generated other than in academia. So we shouldn't always be looking for academic resources. We need to look at what might be called grey resources. Do we actually learn in advance about things? To what extent do we actually in our knowledge do we develop knowledge of attacks or defences before they arise, or are we always doing historic analysis of attacks and defences that have already arisen? And when we do the theoretical stuff, we do experiments and we hypothesize about the future, do the hypotheses we make up and the models and the experiments we do those influence the future, or are they kind of not influential of the future? So timing of cybersecurity knowledge. One of the things I've noticed as a practitioner is that very often I come into a situation and I don't know the history, and because I don't know the history of what's there, what the decisions were made, what's happened, I'm in a state of not knowing, and people accept the fact that an expert they bring in may initially not be knowing, but it's understood that somebody who is competent is aware of what they don't know, and therefore they know the right questions to ask. So it's interesting to explore that aspect, that an aspect of knowledge can be knowing what you don't know. So we look at motivation. Why does cybersecurity knowledge get produced or even suppressed? So there may be knowledge that isn't available to in outside organisations or in academia because it's being prevented from being published. There are constraints on the production cybersecurity knowledge, limits of our own senses. Most of our cybersecurity engagement is going to be through visual means or perhaps through audio means, but we're not able to use sight or sound or touch. Especially in cloud environments, we're very limited in what we can access, and we have to use tools, so we have electronically mediated access to information. So we need to understand the limits and the constraints on cybersecurity knowledge production. We also need to think about how we ask questions. So do we make assumptions? Is there a bias in how we ask questions where we assume that things are insecure unless proved otherwise, or do we assume things are secure unless proved otherwise? How do we ask the questions? So my hope is that the draft list of questions I've put out will actually be useful to other people. I'm really looking for feedback. I expect there's lots of things I haven't thought about, probably lots of things I haven't expressed very well in the paper, so feedback was much appreciated. In terms of where I'm going next, I have my interest in the topic of epistemology awakened. I hope other people find this presentation interesting and are interested. I'm thinking that as I do my PhD, and I haven't yet done my confirmation of status, so I've still got a little bit of wiggle room in the scoping of my PhD research, but I'm thinking that I'm actually going to be looking at how the sources of knowledge differ through different parts of the construction sector. So in pre-construction, there are probably different sources of knowledge and different ontologies from during construction, which might not have any internet connected entities in, and through the life cycle. So I'm thinking about how the sources of knowledge would be different at those different stages of the physical construction life cycle. I have to credit both my supervisors and all the people I've cited in the work, and I've used some third-party images as well as on my own images. And now I'd really like to open up to questions. I think there are already a couple of questions that have come in on the Q&A, and really solicit some inputs from the people here. If you don't feel like you want to reply now and you want to reply afterwards offline, that's fine. The next slide will actually have my contact details on it. But let's see what's coming in from the Q&A.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, we have a few questions already. So let's start with the first one from Cyril. What would you advise about how to, sorry.
Yeah, I can read the question. I'll read the question. So what would you advise, my advice be to how cybersecurity curricula is formed, since most are formed without much consideration of epistemology? Really like the question. Thank you, Cyril. So I think if there could just be a brief coverage of this topic in curricula to make people aware that it is a thing, that it's something they may need to think about, and perhaps pointers to key summary references. I've included a summary reference in my bibliography. I think it's really useful to people to be aware of it, not necessarily going into it until they get to doctoral level, but even at lower levels, at bachelor's and master's, I think it'd be useful if it's mentioned. I also think that we should be conscious in our research of epistemological asymmetry in the education process. So effectively, you have a situation where the people higher up in the educational hierarchy have knowledge that isn't available to people who've less experience. But you can also have situations where people with less experience develop new knowledge that needs to find its way into higher levels of the hierarchy. So I think it's really important to keep a dialogue going about the sources of knowledge and how education should be a continuously improving process. I didn't mention it in my references, but one of my favourite meta models for learning is the Gregory Bateson's models of four-level model of learning: level 1, level 2, level 3 learning. And I think that there's almost needs to be a conscious effort to structure learning so that different types of learning and feedback can take place. And I think that'd be a very interesting thing could cybersecurity education be aligned with Bateson's levels of learning? That would be a really nice topic for somebody to take on. I'm afraid it's too big a topic for me to take on, but hopefully that's answered that question.
So then another question there, always from Cyril again, is asking, did you consider current timelines when the linguistic word cybersecurity became available and then prevalent?
Yes, I did actually. That's in the paper, and the best knowledge we have is that cybersecurity came into common usage in, I think, 1989, which was about 3 years after the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in America. Although, interestingly, if you look at other uses of the word cyber, cyberpunk and things like that, that would really date to the sort of late 70s, early 80s. So I think that's an interesting point, but effectively the cybersecurity didn't become a word until after the idea that there could be actions with computers that were contrary to the law and contrary to the needs of civil society. So it has really emerged since 1989, taken lots of meaning. One of the things I'd just like to say, if we have got time, I object to the idea of people talking about cybersecurity as an assemblage, which is a very popular term in sort of French, Bruno Latour. The idea that you can't really get your handles around this amorphous thing. I think you can get your handles around cybersecurity, and really the social constructionists who try and say cybersecurity is undefinable or it's mysterious, they just haven't spent enough time understanding it. So another question.
Yeah, we have one last question, I think. So your definition of cybersecurity did not include the three major components of cybersecurity: people, process, and technology.
Yeah.
Would you mind
Uh,
explaining?
Yeah, and I'm really happy to take that head on. So, I specifically didn't want to get into an ontological bound. I needed to have some ontological boundaries, but I didn't want to have sort of minimum criteria that would exclude from the scope of these questions something that didn't have all of them. So if you had something that was maybe um, just just technical and had some impacts, but didn't really have people involved. So let's say you had a I don't know a lethal autonomous robot um, where the the integrity of the I mean it's horrible things that people shouldn't create them, but they have them apparently in in Singapore and so forth. If you get a situation where you haven't got one element of the I don't want it to be excluded from the definition, so I wanted to come up with some boundaries around it. So it has to be computer mediated, and there has to be some impacts on society, and there has to be some protection against those impacts. But other than saying there's some computer technology, there's some impacts, and there's some protection against those impacts. I didn't really want to get into more specification that would then exclude certain scenarios. So that was the reason for coming up with that rather, in some ways, loose definition, but at the same time, it's an inclusive definition that doesn't really exclude lots of areas of inquiry.